So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for coming on to the Organizational Culture webinar. It's really lovely to have you here this evening. There's quite a few of you on the line, so welcome. Welcome particularly to those people who I have worked with before, and a special welcome also to those people with whom I have not worked before. So a little bit about me and also about the topic that I'm talking to you about this evening that I'm really passionate about, which is around looking at the achievement, support, or power and role cultures and organizations, with the intention being to have a look at 5 key considerations around cultural change and how to change cultures when we need to change cultures, which is often a very difficult thing to do, although many people seem to think that it's actually quite an easy process. It can be very complicated and quite difficult, but overall, if you've got the right strategy and the right structure and the people in place, then it need not be that difficult. So welcome. Just a little bit about me. I won't stay here too long. I appreciate some of you seen this before, so in the new year I think I'll change the introduction to my webinars. But who am I? I'm a business owner. I do international leadership development and team development. I work on 4 different continents. I work in Africa, Australia, Fiji, and in January I'll be working in Papua New Guinea. I'm an executive coach, a psychologist, and I've been developing leaders and teams really to grow organizations for over 25 years. So I've been doing a lot of work in the leadership, team development, and organizational development space. My firm focus really is on developing leaders and teams. Those would probably be my 2 areas of passion, because I often believe that the greater and more impactful results that we have in organizations are achieved through teams that work well together. I write books, I'm a columnist, and I do a lot of keynote speaking at probably 20 to 30 conferences a year. So pretty involved in a whole range of different things, but the only reason I really shared this background with you is that obviously it then gives me the opportunity to talk to you about some of the topics I like to do on the webinars. And essentially what we do is we run 1 webinar every month, and the idea behind that is to help business owners and leaders and people like yourselves become a lot more proficient in running organizations or teams or learning about a whole range of different business issues. I also run another program called Empowering Women to Thrive, which is all about helping women become more empowered and confident in their own way. But today we're focusing on culture and organizational culture and what that means. So these are just some of the people that I've actually been really lucky to work with. I think it's always nice to bring a bit of personal aspect. It's not really personal, it's more professional, but to give you an understanding of some of the people I work with and some of the work that I do. Sometimes I wake up, and tell me whether you think this is you. Do you ever wake up thinking, oh my gosh, what's the right way up? It's a Monday morning and I'm feeling exhausted and I'm thinking to myself, oi, what's the right way to get out of bed today? By the way, on the bottom left-hand corner of the screen is our new corporate logo. We've just done a rebranding, and we start a new website, or we launch a new website next Friday, which is all really exciting for us. So new image, new start, new website, and off we go. Or do you wake up sometimes feeling this way? Bad hair day, not too sure which you're going to be doing today and just feeling out of sorts. Or you get into work and you think, I'm so tired of trying to sort this team out, this person out, this organization out. And I think very often when I talk about these topics in the webinars, as I said earlier, it's just about trying to help people like yourselves learn how to run teams more effectively, organizations more effectively, and ultimately to help yourself and others be better at what you do. So when we talk about organizational culture, I'm often asked, well, what is organizational culture? So organizational culture is a very interesting concept. And essentially it's a group, or it's a commonality of shared assumptions, values, beliefs, which governs how people behave in an organization. And I think it's a really important thing when we talk about shared assumptions, values, and beliefs. Very often, if an organization doesn't have shared values or shared beliefs, you often have difficulties because people tend to pull in different directions. But essentially, these shared values have an influence on the people in the organization and ultimately dictate how they dress, they act, and they perform in their roles. So an example would be, my daughter works in advertising, and it's really interesting to see what they wear when they go to advertising organizations. It's completely different to what I might see in a corporate organization, or indeed even in a community-based organization. So they're able to wear things like boots or shorts or, you know, long shirts over shorts. And really, I suppose it's more of a kind of funky culture. In the corporate environment, the culture is more around more suits and high-heeled shoes and, you know, black skirts. Whereas in the community sector, it seems to be a little bit more relaxed in ways where we just sort of tend to wear things that are equally smart, just not quite as dressy. And, you know, those are the kind of things that I suppose depict some of the things that we regard as organizational culture. So when we talk about organizational culture, I love this saying because I think it's so true. Culture to an organization is what personality is to an individual. It's how the company feels to people working inside of it or looking at it from the inside or indeed the outside. So for example, if you walk into an organization and it's quite homely, people are smiling, people are greeting each other, people look as if they're actually enjoying their work, we'd call that a sort of friendly culture, or we might call it a culture where there's a sense of achieving of goals and supporting of each other. And if we walk into another organization where everybody looks quite stern and nobody seems to be talking to each other and there doesn't seem to be a whole heap of fun, but a lot of sort of cross faces or, you know, very focused, people might say, it doesn't feel as warm in this organization. And if people don't sort of greet each other, you might think, oh my gosh, it feels almost like quite an austere organization to walk into, and it could be one more around cultures of power and role. And as I go through the webinar, I'll explain to you what I mean by those 4 organizational culture types, because I think it's important for you to understand that every single organization needs all of those 4 types in their organization to thrive. However, it's really what you're looking for are organizations with a major focus on having cultures as a dominant combination of achievement and support, and that's what I'll explain to you as I move through the presentation. So when we talk about principles of organizational culture, I think it's important that we understand that organizational culture isn't something that's upgraded or overhauled quickly. I had a discussion with the CEO, interestingly, in, I think it was September actually, and she called us in because she was wanting to change her organizational culture, and she asked me whether we could help her, which we could, and I said we could, and she said, oh, well, we really want the culture to be changed by the end of November, beginning of December. And I think it's important to understand that a culture takes a long period of time, and I actually believe that culture is an outcome. Culture is not a process. Culture is not a system or a policy. Culture is the outcome of what you have done over a period of time and what you left with. And I'll explain a little bit more about what I mean just now, but it's not like deciding, well, you're going to change the HR grievance policy, where, you know, so you come up with something new, somebody reviews it, somebody signs it off, then you communicate it to the staff and off you go. No, culture is an outcome of a whole range of different things. So number one, it doesn't take a short period of time. Number two, it can't be overhauled quickly. And I think this is an important point. It's much more about doing than saying. You know, we can say that we treat each other well, and our culture is to be respectful, and our culture is about, you know, behaving in polite and, you know, engaging ways. It's easy to say things, ladies and gentlemen, but the more important thing is, how do we behave? So if you've got a culture that says, or really it's not a culture, it's words on a wall, that says that we will behave in a way that looks like A, and yet then we behave in a way that actually is B, you actually have a cultural disconnect or a cultural misfit. In other words, what you're saying the culture is not what the culture truly is. And so somewhere along the way, we've either got it wrong, somewhere along the way, the leaders have misunderstood what culture really is, and ultimately leading to a situation where what you think you have is not what you do have. And interestingly, leaders in the organization will think, oh, we've got this great culture. But then if you scratch the surface and you understand what people down the line say, it's a completely different feel and ultimately different opinion of what culture is. Actions that change cultures are things like empowering your staff, collaboration between people, improving relationships by having a strong set of guidelines around behaviors and living them. I always have a great interest in the code of conduct on the wall. Most organizations we go into, I talk about a code of conduct, and generally they're long. One organization we've been working with has got a code of conduct that's 13 pages long. Well, that's crazy, and it's also meaningless, because 13 pages, and if I say to the cleaner down the line or the secretary, what is a code of conduct, they can't tell me. And if people don't live it, if people don't know what it is, if people can't actually, behave like that on an ongoing basis and live a code of conduct, which ultimately is one of the components of your culture, there's no point in having it. So when we say things like, oh, we've got a really achievement and support culture where we achieve our goals and we support each other, and yet we don't have strategies where we empower our staff to do things, and we, form projects where they collaborate with each other, or we don't have strong strategies to improve relationships, but we say that we've got achievement of a culture of achievement and support. You haven't. You've just got words on a wall, which really, as I say, are quite meaningless. So ultimately, as I've just said, culture is more about doing than about saying. Research says that having better and more productive teams improves workplace culture, and a happy team makes for happy customers. So when we talk about teams, I often talk about teams. To get a good, I suppose, thermometer check on organizations, one of the great ways to start with is to see the morale within teams across the organization. So you might do a bit of a check across different teams in different parts of the organization, even, for example, a little survey or a focus group to determine what it is that they are doing, or how they view the organization, or how they view the culture in their team, or the culture in their organization. And very often you get a very clear picture if you go down the line and speak to teams and individuals. I think the other thing that maybe I did not include in the principle, perhaps I did, but I'll just quickly add it in here, is that organizational cultures often have subcultures within that one culture. So what I mean by that is that marketing, for example, might have a very different subculture in marketing to sales. Sales might be much more around competitiveness and go, 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 and whoever gets the most sales is the sort of salesperson of the day. So more, I guess, around power and achievement, whereas in, for example, an employee engagement team, it might be more around supporting of each other and helping each other get goals and achieve goals, and a greater focus on relationships. So the important thing when you're designing cultures and organizations is to understand that subcultures ultimately constitute a main culture, but therein lies part of the challenge, is that in order to change the overall culture, you've also got to focus on thinking about what those subcultures are. In my experience of working with cultures over 25 years, I have learned a valuable lesson. And one of the valuable lessons I've learned is to use the authentic, informal leaders in your organization to change or to help change the culture. I could tell so many stories, but the one I'll tell is of a lady called Pat. Pat was a really interesting female. She wasn't interested in change. She wasn't interested in culture. She was really an interesting personality. She was very involved in power. She was in a fairly authoritative position. She had a lot of people under her. She was a powerful figure. Well, her role was powerful, and I think she used it really, in some ways, not to the great advancement of her team or the organization. When we wanted to implement this enormous change program into an organization I was consulting in, and this particular organization was also merging at the same time with another one, we formed a cross-functional team to help us. That's a whole other story, but in essence, that's an organizational development strategy. One of the things I remember saying to this group, and there were 21 people driving the change, and the cultural change was one of the outcomes, was to get the informal leaders involved. And there was a lot of discussion and debate, should we, shouldn't we? And I said, absolutely. We actually approached Pat, this informal leader, in ways. She wasn't on the committee, but you know, she was a leader in her own right, and she was, even though she wasn't a member of management, she was very powerful. So what we did was we actually used Pat to help us drive the change forward. And it was really interesting because when we actually involved her in the cultural change process in her area, she became one of the greatest champions of cultural change that I think I've ever seen in my 2.5 decades of doing organizational leadership development, you know, team development change. She was fabulous. So never look past informal leaders to help. Also to make sure your formal leaders are on their game. So what I mean by that is that, you know, I've had all examples of formal leaders in the past who say, yes, they're really on to it. Yep, they're going to make the change and they're going to lead the charge in their areas. And yet, unless they really are on their game and they have, you know, strategies and key performance indicators and measurements that they're going to actually achieve to help the culture change and the change transformation process to go through, very often I believe that the formal leaders, specifically those at the top, are one of the major reasons why culture change and transformational processes don't succeed. And I think that's the other thing. Behaviors are always linked to business outcomes. You know, very often in organizations, the greatest focus is on the task, getting the job done, and, you know, how many pairs of shoes you've got to make in an hour, or how many people you've got to feed in an aged care service in, you know, a day. And so numbers and figures and, you know, rosters. And so those are what we call tasks. But what's really interesting is that there's less, or has significantly been less, reliance on people's behaviors to achieve tasks, or people's behaviors and relationships in organizations to achieve business outcomes. So I always say that if we're going to have a culture, it has to be a culture really with a focus largely on achievement of goals and support of each other. And ultimately then when we talk about behaviors, then it's about behaviors that show that we are supportive. So behaviors are supportive when they look like they are people asking other people, do you need my help? They are people who will stay back another hour to help a struggling team member. They are team members who will go over to another and say, look, I see that you're really struggling. Why don't you go home and let me take over? You know, behaviors that are linked to business outcomes. Because if you've just got great behaviors for the sake of great behaviors that are not linked to business performance, whilst it might be a feel-good organization, it becomes more of a social club than a business environment. And use cross-functional strategies to create impact. That's actually an organizational development initiative, but those are one of the key principles I've found in my years of doing this work that work particularly well. So here's, there's various models of change. The reason why I've put this in is Lewin's model of change is, Kurt Lewin was a change model theorist, very well known in the industry, and he had a very simple model of change, which looks a little bit muzzy on this PowerPoint, so I apologize for that. The number one is to look at your organization and say, okay, our culture is not working at the moment. What is not working? Where do we need to improve? What do we want? What's the vision for the future? So the unfreeze is around what do we have? Where are we? To do a SWOT analysis, maybe strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Where are we right now? And ultimately, where do we want to be? So you're trying to look at an organization and unfreeze where it is so that you can move towards refreezing into a much more productive and effective way. But in between unfreeze and refreeze is all the change processes that you need to put in so that the change then becomes evident over time. So those could be things like vision, launch, strategies, really assessment of the goals, job descriptions, key performance indicators, the way we do things around here, much more project management potentially, a lot more focus on employee engagement, employee say, it could be cross-functional teams, social engagements, so a whole range of different strategies that go into the change stage. And then ultimately, once you're doing that, you're driving to refreeze, which is to reinforce the change that you're bringing through the organization and over time to anchor the change. Now, what's interesting in cultural change is that what we know in organizations, and of course, cultural change or model of cultural change involves culture. So, you know, if you're a culture at unfreeze, by the time you get to refreeze, you're going to have a completely different culture. But I think one of the key things in cultural change is that you actually make it as a strategic initiative, not just, oh, well, we've refrozen, we've got all these strategies and things happening and we're a much more efficient business. That may be the case, but I think culture needs to be a very carefully aligned strategy to the overall vision, mission, and strategic plan. And thus, when you introduce change, you've got to also incorporate what you're going to do about managing culture so that you create a much more effective and a much more productive culture moving forward. So when we talk about designing cultures in organizations, we're talking about, so what do we really need to do? Well, firstly, we've got to define what do we want. So what are those kind of cultures? You know, you might have, let's say, a culture of power. And blame. So power and blame is where you have often organizations where people use and abuse their positional power, you know, jobs for the boys, or I don't necessarily mean that disparagingly, jobs for the girls, you know. If you're in the in club, you get the job. The authoritarian style of leadership, my way or the highway, where people are fearful and scared to go, you know, to do anything wrong or to jump out of their box because they're going to get their head sort of crashed in, sort of thing. And you know, they people aren't innovative, they're not creative. You don't walk into this culture of power and blame, or where there's lots of fun and laughter. People are head down, very austere. So what you need to do is define, what do we want? And if we want an achievement and support a culture where people get the job done, but they actually really like working together and have fun, then you've got to work out, so where are we now, which is the unfree stage of Lewin's model, and what do we actually want? Then you've got to work out, okay, so what we want is, we've got to talk about what we want. We've got to get input from people and maybe train people in what it is that we want. So that's, I mean, these are just general points I'm making, but between talk about what you want and training people about what you want comes a whole range of strategies to get there. But essentially, you've got to work out what it is, and ultimately you have to live it. You know, when you go to the refree stage, it's all about living what we want, particularly leaders. There have been so many times in the years that I've been doing this, and I think this is an important point I want to make. You can have all the cultural change and the organizational transformation strategies, policies, procedures. You can pay mountains of money, or you can pay very little money to change, you know, from unfreeze to change to refreeze. And all of that is absolutely, ladies and gentlemen, null and void if the person sitting at the top of the organization either says yes and doesn't do anything, i.e. pays lip service, or is disengaged from the process. Seriously, it's a waste of money. The king, queen, or king is critical to driving transformational change or cultural change in an organization. So if they pay lip service, it's not going to work. And because obviously the person really who is accountable and responsible for creating organizational change is the CEO. Now, that also means, therefore, that the people and the leaders down the line are just as responsible. But as one of my favorite presidents of the United States said, the buck stops here. If the guy or gal at the top does not lead the change, you're going nowhere fast. And measure it. I think this is a key thing. How are we going? So many change initiatives have been started, and ultimately people say, oh, we're doing really well. And I'll say, well, that's good. So how have you measured? Oh, people seem to smile more. Okay, that's a measurement, but based on what? Oh, I don't know. They just seem to smile. Not a measurement. So measurements are things like survey monkeys, even keep it simple, focus groups, statistics, maybe increase in productivity, efficiencies, systems working more effectively and fluidly, all those kind of things. So designing a culture is not just, well, let's do this and do that and we're off we go. It's quite strategic, it's systematic, and it's very precise. And ultimately reward, so give people what makes them tick. You know, you want a culture where people are encouraged to do their best and they are rewarded when they do their best. And I just want to make the distinction here between being rewarded and doing their job, I guess. If you pay somebody $10 to peel 10 potatoes, then that is their job. But if they peel 20 potatoes, even though you've only paid them $10 to peel 10 potatoes, then they're deserving of some sort of a reward. Now, a reward or recognition could be as simple as, thank you so much, I'm so grateful. That's recognition. A reward could be, you know what, you've worked so hard that I'm going to give you 2 hours off at the end of the week. So that's a reward for them. So the really important thing to understand is that I'm a firm believer is that you do not reward and recognize people for doing their jobs. Thank you is absolutely wonderful. You know, say they're doing a great job, absolutely, even though they're doing their job. I think it's wonderful to validate and to praise people. But if we get into the domain of reward and recognition and you're paying them more for doing what they're paid to do, I think you're setting a very dangerous precedent, so be careful. Changing an existing culture it's a very difficult thing to do, but there are things, and this really is the 5 stages of changing an existing culture. Number 1 is to evaluate where you are right now. So what are the priorities, the values, the behaviors, and the weaknesses? You can't change anything unless you know where you are. And then obviously, you know, as I said earlier in another slide, you have to work out where you want to go. What's the vision? And as part of that vision, what does your culture look like? And remember that culture is a feel. It's how we act, how we behave, how we dress, how we speak to each other even. The look, the feel of an organization when people walk in. And then the 3rd step is what are the exact behaviors and values that you do want? And what I like to do at step number 3 is to start getting my people involved. So you ask people down the line, you might ask the cleaner, the secretary, the manager, the gardener, you know, the wellness instructor. Get people from all levels of your organization to contribute, because the more people who contribute are first and foremost the greater level of input and diversity, but also I think the greater involvement and employee engagement you get, because they feel as if they're valued, they feel if they're making impact, and it makes a difference moving forward. Step number 4 is actually, now that we understand what people think and maybe where we want to go, let's get our strategic priorities right. So what are we going to do first that's going to match our vision and our mission and our strategic plan? And I often think that culture, as I said to you, it's just an outcome, but each of the things that you're wanting to do to have a transformational process in your organization need to be, I think, staged. Stage 1, we'll do this. Stage 2, we'll do that. Stage 3, we'll do that. So you get your priorities right based on the strategic outcomes that you want and the time frames that you have against those priorities. 5 is to get your team together and follow SMART goals. Love SMART goals. I'm sure you've all heard of SMART goals. If you haven't, may I please encourage you to go onto the internet and have a look at what they are. But SMART goals essentially is a small organizational tool that's used around the world everywhere. SMART. S is for specific, M for measurable, A for achievable, R for realistic, and T for time-bound. And if you're able to put your plans and goals into the SMART format, generally you will be able to achieve what you want to, as long as, and I think this is an important point, as long as next to your SMART goals is an action plan to determine how you will actually achieve those goals. So SMART goals is stage 1. Stage 2, just as critical as stage 1, is an action plan. And of course, I'm a big one on measuring progress. You know, I think if you don't measure how far you've come, if you don't actually assess or monitor how you're doing, then very often you can be seduced into thinking that you're actually doing really well and the strategies and the processes you're putting in are working. But they might not be either. And if you don't measure them through a whole range of different ways of doing it, then you might be thinking that you're doing well, but actually you're not. So I'm a big one on measuring how you're going. At any time, ladies or gentlemen, there are a lot of you on the line. If you would like to ask me a question, you're really welcome to do so. I'm very happy to answer whatever I can for you. Okay. So key points to changing an organization's culture. I think this is important, and these are really important points. Number 1, I follow the work of a gentleman called Roger Harrison when it comes to organizational change and culture. Roger Harrison was an organizational developmental psychologist and theorist, and he studied organizational cultures and transformational change for, I think it was over 4 decades. But Roger Harrison was the one who came up with the fact that there are 4 different types of organization culture. One is power, one is role, one is achievement, and one is support. So power is all around, authority. So the buck has to stop somewhere. Who has the authority to do what? And the role is about whose role is it to do what? Who is responsible for what and who's accountable for what? The third one is achievement, which is all about goal setting, smart goal setting, working out where you want to go, and then designing strategies and processes to achieve those goals. And then the fourth and last one is support. So how we relate with each other, the behaviors in the organization, the relationships. Do we help each other? Do we support each other? Or do we have an organization where, and these are organizations that I really struggle with and I try and do our very best to turn around, where you have the culture of, well, that's not my job. So low performing organizations, you will often find that's not my job, whereas high performing organizations will say everything's my job and I'll do everything I need to help the team move forward. So changing an organization's culture takes between 3 to 5 years, according to Roger Harrison. I have mentioned before that there are many subcultures in organizations. We've got one department that might have a subculture different to another, or you might have one department with different subcultures in that department. And I think what's really interesting around that is that subcultures and changing subcultures to move towards one big culture, whilst interesting and diverse, can be really difficult. And an example would be, I was watching a documentary last night about the prison systems in the United States. It was a very interesting documentary because it talked about the different gangs in this one jail. Now, you might say, well, gangs, it's like different subcultures. And it was talking about, they call them the Bloods versus, I think it was the Latinos. And it was talking about showing you these different groups or subcultures, which is exactly what they are, and how the Bloods have a whole different way of wearing their hair and what they wear to the Latinos. And what was also interesting was when new people come into the prison system, i.e. criminals, how these two subcultures, or gangs if you like, vie to try and recruit the newcomers into their particular subcultures. And ultimately, the idea here is to try and make each of the subcultures stronger than the other to gain dominance and power over the other. Now, obviously, it's not exactly the same in organizations, but it can be where you've got 2 different factions in a team or 2 different subcultures in a team, kind of vying for supremacy or more role rosters or whatever it is over the other. And it becomes more difficult then when you've got subcultures. Cultural change must be professionally and systematically implemented. A plan has to be formulated. And that's why many organizations don't necessarily try and do cultural change on their own. It really is worth your while if you're wanting to change your culture, even if it's not to get somebody in all the way, but to get some professional advice, because there's nothing more badly done than to try and change an organization's culture and it's not professionally or systematically done. It can actually make the situation a lot worse. And I think the important thing is that to actually do it well is not that difficult, as long as you've got a plan, people, and a process. And one of the things I think is important is relentless communication about what we want and how we're going. One of the real big issues that we find in organizations is that people at the top know what's going on. They talk about the strategy or the plan behind closed doors. And then the worst kept secrets are those when behind closed doors things leak out, and ultimately everything that's going on at the tops is leaked out down the organizational grapevine, and of course everybody knows what's going on. So it's the worst kept secret, except the leaders at the top of the organization think they've got this confidentiality under control. And I think that's just a real waste of time. One of the key strategies then in organizational change or cultural change is to consistently and continually communicate with your people through a range of different things: team meetings, team briefings, staff briefings, a conference, getting people together, intranets, newsletters, Facebook, whatever it is. Talk to your people, tell them what's going on, because here's the thing, they know anyway. Build on strengths and phase out weaknesses of the organization. So when you look at your organization, think, oh my gosh, there's so many things we don't do well, but there's a few things we do well. I think it's important to turn that around and realize you do many, many things well, but you're wanting to change some things that no longer work. So focus on and building on the strengths, and then ultimately focus on, you know, working out, okay, so what am I going to do to then think about what strategies should I then put in place, or what team should I put in place, or what am I going to do ultimately to try and, you know, drive the organization forward so that in the end of the day, you've got a process and a strategy moving forward to be able to take the organization to where, or the team where you want it to go. So I think that's an important point. All of those are really important points to think about. Focus on long term, particularly after the honeymoon excitement phase is over. After, very often you've announced that, you know, we're wanting to change the culture and we're going to change the organization. Often there's obviously a lot of, you know, uncertainty and insecurity. And largely, by the way, the uncertainty and insecurity in organizations comes through management and leaders not communicating regularly about what's going on. So people are left to think or to pontificate or to wonder or to stress over what's going on. But if you've then decided, okay, you're going to tell them, and, you know, change brings a lot of really great things to it. A lot of new exciting processes, maybe even people, systems, a lot of opportunities. But generally, if you focus on the long term, you know, and whilst the excitement of the change is so great, or even the disillusionment, as I said, because some people may not like it, it's really important that the focus is on the long term and the change is sustained over a long period of time. So that's really, I mean, you know, I could keep talking about organizational cultural change. I think the important thing to understand are various. Number one, it's not that easy. Number two, it should be systematic. Number three, it needs to be very well thought out. And it also needs, you need a range of people to help you do that. You need to have systems where you can monitor what you're doing and being able to assess progress, and also then to be able to modify if things aren't working, modify what you need to do so that you can actually get the change process or the cultural change process back on track. So I'm really happy to take any calls, I mean not any calls, sorry, any chats from you, any questions that you may have, and to just, yeah, to try and help you with any questions that you might want me to answer for you. Okay, so I've got a question here from John, and the question is, so at the end of the day, who is responsible for changing cultures in an organization? Well, I think at the outset, the reason why organizations need to change or transformational changes happen in organizations are various. So mergers, acquisitions, changing market demands, organizations not doing well, some wondering whether they'll survive, changing technology, legislation, customer demand, so many things. So I think that the actual design of transformational cultural change needs to be done at the top of the organization without any hesitation of doubt. And I made the comment just now that if the top person and the board are not on board, then I honestly don't recommend you spend the money or the effort or the energy. So the ultimate person in charge is the CEO, because the buck stops there. Equally as important are the leaders down the line who walk the talk and who live and dream and, you know, show all the energy and the contribution and commitment to the new way of being and the culture, and ultimately to call people up down the line when they're not behaving in that way. But I think to answer the question quite simply, really, John, it's everybody in an organization. It's not just one person. I think for a whole organization to change, everybody needs to be held accountable and responsible for their part of the process of change. Some you will lose because they don't want to be part of that anymore, and some you'll keep and some will be really energized. And the other thing that's equally exciting is that often you'll just get new blood who come in and, you know, just pick up with more energy and off you go, and that's really exciting. So what we will do is I would be very happy to give any of you a free strategic review. There's no cost to you on your culture or on any of your strategy or your leadership strategy. What you would have to do is to book on TimeTrade. So TimeTrade is an online tool where you go into TimeTrade and it'll give you the times that I'm available to chat with you. Normally it lasts for about an hour. But what I will also do is I will get my PA, her name is Mariana, and Mariana will approach you tomorrow, probably through an email, to ask you whether you would like to do a TimeTrade assessment. And as I say, it's free, and so why not, to see if there's anything I could assess that maybe you need to do in your organization. So besides that, ladies and gentlemen, it's been a pleasure talking to you this evening. Thank you so much for your time. I will be doing one more webinar this year. As most of you know, I run them every month. And the numbers on the webinar seem to be getting more and more and more, which is really great. And I will run one more for November, and then we will start again probably January, February. So in the meantime, if I can help you in any way, we're about to, as I say, launch our new website next week, but the old one's still up. So if I can help you in any way, just contact me through then, or you can contact me on info@puremagicbusiness.com.au. So until the next time, it's been fantastic, and thank you so much for your time. God bless and stay well. Bye.